Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 143. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, October the 12th, from the James Strong studio in western St. Charles County. Well, it's finally autumn here in the great Midwest, 34 degrees this morning in western St. Charles County. It's October. It's baseball season. Our Cardinals are playing in October. And anytime a baseball team is playing ball in October, that's a good thing. That's a real good thing because that means you're in the postseason. But October is an interesting time of year because all three sports are now playing. Baseball playoffs, hockey has started. Basketball has started, and football is well underway in October. Only month that we have all three sports playing. And that's part of what the podcast is about today. Not baseball or football or hockey, but in an indirect way, basketball. And I'm linking the NBA to the topic of today's podcast, which is communism is the new capitalism. Now you're thinking to yourself, what are you talking about here, Strong? Communism is the new capitalism. Communism and capitalism are on two opposite ends of the spectrum. Once upon a time, that was true. Anymore, not so much. And I will explain. Before we do that, though, I did want to just mention about the podcast. Good numbers for the podcast again. I thank you for your support. All kinds of ways to get the podcast. Where's my paper? Here it is. I've got my coffee and I've got my water and I misplaced my paper. The ways to get the podcast, all kinds of different media sources to listen to the James Strong Show podcast on. iTunes, iHeartRadio, Player FM, Facebook, Twitter, TuneIn, Radio Online, the podcast app, YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcast, CastBox, SoundCloud. Is that enough? Oh, and there's one more, Spreaker.com. But the easiest way to get the podcast is simply send me an email. My email address is jamesstrongshow@hotmail.com. I'll see what your email address is. I put you on the fans list, and then I send you a podcast link as soon as it's published, so you can download it and listen to it at your leisure. And please, 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 I ask this as a favor to you, share the podcast with at least one friend. I ask you to do that after you listen to it today. Pick out a buddy, a pal, an associate, and just say, you know what, I'm going to send you this link. Listen to this Knotheads podcast. I think you'll like it. That's the best way to grow the podcast. That's a sales 101 type thing. The best way to get new sales is to go to your existing customers. If you're listening to the podcast, you're an existing customer. A recommendation from you to a potential new customer would be greatly appreciated by me. Okay, we're done. Let's go to the podcast now. Communism is the new capitalism. China has 1.3 million people in that country. Lots of people, okay? 1.3 million people. It's the largest market in the world. Depending on which standard you view it from, it's the largest economy in the world. It's almost the largest economy in the world. We're still the biggest by most measures. However, you got to think that one day China is going to be a bigger economy than the U.S. simply because there's 4 times more people there than here. Okay, everybody's standard of living is increasing. The Chinese standard of living continues to increase. Granted, from a much more dismal place. In other words, there's a lot more room for progress for the average Chinese citizen than there is for the average U.S. citizen. But one day, maybe sooner, maybe later, China will be the biggest economy in the world just because there's so many people, okay? And businesses really, really, really want to get a foothold in China. You can't blame them. 1.3 billion potential customers. Our company has tried to do that as well, the day job company for which I work. And for many years, the Chinese consumers have preferred Western brands over Chinese brands because they were cooler, they were better quality. Everything was great. But now all of a sudden, some things have changed. Let me sip my coffee. It's early this morning, so I haven't had all my coffee yet. Yeah, I can't remember what I was saying because I didn't drink my coffee. Okay, Chinese consumers have for years liked the Western brands over the Chinese brands, but things are changing, and they're changing for a few reasons. Let me give you a few examples. There's a snack called Three Squirrels Nut Snacks. Okay, and they're basically just different types of fruity, nutty snacks. That is now circumvented Oreos, the Mondelez brand. And even though Oreos tried to get into the Chinese market with such tasty Oreo brands as seaweed, wasabi, and spicy chicken wing Oreos. Sounds nasty to us, but Chinese folks have different tastes than we do, okay? The biggest sports brand for many years over there, and still is Nike. However, there's a new sports brand called Li Ning, and that's starting to just eat Nike's lunch over in China, okay? Now, why are the Chinese consumers all of a sudden choosing Chinese brands over Western brands? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, the quality is now better, okay? It used to be the Chinese stuff was garbage. The Western stuff, even though it was made in China, was much better quality. Now the Chinese stuff is getting to be a better quality. And with all the trade war talk, made in China is patriotic for a Chinese citizen. Just like over here, made in USA. Yeah, we want to wave the flag and buy our stuff. They're the same way. Now that the quality is closer to the Western stuff, they're buying Chinese stuff. Now, the quality is better. How did they get that way? Kind of simple, and you may have heard this in the news. The Chinese make no bones about stealing intellectual property. In other words, if you're a business and you want to open a factory in China, first of all, you just can't go to China and open a factory. You have to go to China and have a joint venture with a Chinese company. That's code word for the Chinese government because Chinese companies are linked to the government. They're part of the government for all intents and purposes. So when Nike manufactures in China, especially for the Chinese market, they've got Chinese people in there. So what do? Well, they steal their intellectual property. They steal the way they make things. They steal the way they market things. That Li Ning brand, basically, it's got the Nike swish on it. They even stole the trademark, okay? And that's one of the big things that the Chinese will do, and that's one of the big things with all this trade negotiation that's going on, is the Chinese government has to stop stealing intellectual property. And not only do they not deny that they steal the intellectual property, they say, yeah, we steal it. We steal it all the time, and we're going to keep stealing it. Now, how do you negotiate with someone like that? It's kind of like the Arabs and the Jews. When the Palestinian state says, death to Israel, we won't stop till Israel has fallen and every Jew is dead. How do you negotiate with that? Do you say, well, how about if you only kill half of us and then we let you have a Palestinian state? Is that how you negotiate? This whole intellectual property thing is the same way. China steals our intellectual property, not just us, U.S., but all Western businesses. They steal intellectual property. They don't deny it, and they say they're not going to stop it. So that's how they get ahead. Websites, for instance, you heard of all these problems with the Houston Rockets owner supporting Hong Kong and the freedom protesters in Hong Kong. Well, websites in China, you can't buy Houston Rockets gear anymore online. See, it's not like this country. Amazon is a U.S. company, but they kind of do what they want just so they follow our laws for the most part. In China, no. The government shuts you down. You cannot buy Houston Rockets stuff in China, okay? Because they don't like what the Houston Rockets owner had to say about Hong Kong. But the Chinese consumers as a whole are going towards Chinese products, like I said before. An example, in 2011, 70% of all smartphones were foreign brands like Nokia, Samsung, and Apple. Now 71% of all smartphones in China are domestic brands. Retail sales in China, they continue to climb, but they've kind of tapered off in recent years. In other words, they're still climbing, but not at the rate that they used to. And when you show that model compared to the U.S. consumers, it's kind of getting to be about, they're starting to consume about as much as we are, okay? Some data is not available because when things go south and the data starts to get bad, the Chinese government doesn't release it. So the figures aren't complete. But for the most part, it shows that the Chinese consumers buy almost as much as the U.S. consumers do now. So that market, that market base, that customer base is growing. Willingness of the Chinese consumer to keep buying foreign products is more important than ever to Western companies. Because consider this, China accounts for about 1/3 of all global growth. 1/3 of all global growth is going to come from China. China is the biggest source of household wealth in the world. And that's who buys most things. People, not businesses, people. Consumer spending is what drives business. And China should surpass the U.S. as the biggest consumer market by maybe 2021 is how the trend is right now. Looking at 5.8 trillion in sales. So they're not the biggest consumer market yet, but very soon they will be. Again, 1.3 billion people. Now, if Chinese consumers don't buy foreign brands as planned, then foreign brands will have to rely on domestic sales to grow. And domestic growth just isn't there, especially in Europe, where domestic growth in Europe has been flat for years. The U.S., not so much, but in Europe, yeah, it's been that way for years. Now, there are some Western brands that still thrive, like Nike. They had a 22% increase just the last quarter. They sold $1.7 billion in stuff in China. Beauty products, personal care products are still doing very well in China. Some Western companies have adapted. Example, Starbucks coffee. There was a Chinese startup called Luckin Coffee that was starting to really take a lot of Starbucks market share. But Starbucks got smart, and they're starting to have a trend similar to what they have in the U.S. They opened a store in Tianjin. In a historic building, they hired a Chinese architect to remodel the building to have a Chinese flavor to it. They added a marble tea bar. In other words, they respected the Chinese culture, and they kind of did what they did here. Here's an old building. They repurposed it, and now it's a cool place to go and drink coffee. So U.S. companies, Western companies are doing what they can to get the Chinese people, the Chinese consumer, on their side. Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut, they're now part of Yum China. Okay, it's a Chinese-owned entity now, but they have durian top pizza. Durian is a real stinky fruit, similar to jackfruit. They also have breakfast porridge that they serve, which is very popular in China. Okay, and by the way, Yum China, now Chinese-owned, they didn't used to be. That's how Western companies must do business in China. They have to be at least partially owned by a Chinese entity. In other words, partially owned by the Chinese government. And quite often, they just throw in the towel and say, yeah, you can just have it all. Just give us a portion of the revenue, or maybe we sell it for so much money. But the Chinese government ends up getting involved partially or wholly at one point or another. And that's how they steal intellectual property, like the sporting goods company, Li Ning. They just copied the Nike swoosh. No ingenuity, no creativity. They just copied it. Okay? Now, Chinese consumers are changing. According to a survey group called Brunswick, 56% of Chinese consumers avoid buying U.S. products. Why? To show support for the U.S., to show support for China in the U.S.-China trade war. That's remarkable. And this doesn't affect just food and clothes and coffee. This affects Hollywood. How does it affect Hollywood? Well, for the first time ever, the top 5 grossing films in China were Chinese films. They don't like the U.S. films as much as they used to. 2 of the biggest films that we've never heard of here because they're not released in this country, Operation Red Sea, and the storyline is a paramilitary group rescues Chinese citizens from Yemen. Okay, there's another